Good Wednesday morning, and today we are here with Dr. John Patrick. Well, actually, what do you want to talk about today, John?
Well, I've been thinking about the people who really matter to me as writers who are not Christian. What I like about serious, honest intellectuals is that they normally come to a point where they see the benefits of faith even though they don't have them themselves. Over the last few weeks, we've been plodding our way through thinking about some of these things using Genesis as a base. And the Patriarchs, to use that lovely word, which is so unpopular with so many people, but nevertheless a description of the history of the world. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, they took a while to learn what God was doing in their lives. They got on with things. Jacob would be a modern businessman for most of his life, so to speak. Abraham didn't really start getting to know who God was until he was, well on. And he was reminded along the way in various quite painful ways that he was in a bigger story than he understood. Jordan Peterson is another example of someone who can see the benefits of faith. He looks at the literature. He knows perfectly well that people who believe have more contented lives, perhaps not the most exciting, but that's up to them. But if you want to hand something on to your children, the best thing you can do is be in a heterosexual marriage that is committed to God. The outcomes are stellar compared to everybody else. David Stowe, the Australian philosopher who hated any sort of dissembling and untruth, and wrote Darwinian fairy tale, saying basically the problem with the Darwinian story is it doesn't deal with a central issue for us, which is moral truth. Jordan Peterson's book that was so popular, it amazed me because when I looked at it, I thought, well, there's not really anything new here. And of course, that's true. We're always rediscovering what was known for a long while. But that set me thinking on where we've got to in the last few weeks, because my sequence of questions that matter wouldn't be quite the same. I was having my eyes tested yesterday, and I don't know quite how it came up even, but I said to the young woman who was doing some of the preliminary tests, we were talking about her family, and I asked her what the lockdown had done to her kids, and she said, well, it's astonishing. He said she got one in the mid-20s, one sort of primary school, and one in between. She said the one in between is ahead of the one who's in his 20s. It's all getting screwed up one way or another. And the conversation went on, and I said, well, from my point of view, the problem is that we don't teach our children what the big questions are, let alone the answer. The oldest writings we've got always go back to the same questions. Where do I come from? Where am I here? Where am I going? Suffering, death. How can I believe in justice in a world like ours? How do I know something is true? What ought I to do? How ought I to live? Nobody can claim authorship for those questions in one form or another. They've been around since writing began. And here we are in the 21st century with the people who educate trying to pretend those questions have no power. They don't last for the whole of recorded history and have no power. And she immediately said, of course. An ordinary person in an ordinary setting, confronted with a way of thinking that she'd not come across before, said, of course. And our problem that underlies the reason for this podcast in many ways is that Christians have become so timid. Here we have in our hands a package which historically has served us incredibly well. Judeo-Christian thought with a little spice from the Greeks really explains everything that's been successful in the world in the last, certainly the last 500 years. That's not something to be ashamed of. it's something to say, well, look at it. Is this what you want? I mean, the people who are complaining about colonialism fail to recognize that we were colonized too. Everybody's been colonized by somebody at some point or another. The only point about Africa is we didn't go there very much because it was a hard place for other people to go to for a long while. So, yeah, they were the last to get hammered in that way. But it's the way history turned out. And frankly, I'm very glad that the Romans came to England, because we were painting ourselves blue when we went into battle and dying by the age of 40, The Romans changed that. They didn't intend to, but they provided the way for the gospel to spread and civilization to spread. So it's worth looking at how they came to that point of view, so that we as Christians, instead of going away and singing happy songs on Sunday morning and allowing ourselves to be labelled idiots, we could start talking a bit more seriously about what has actually happened. And the first question, in the beginning, what? I mean, Genesis, straight up front, in the beginning, God, or no God. Those are the options, and this is a zero sum. Most zero sums are not zero sums. It's one of the other errors of the modern young, who think if somebody's got rich, it must always be at somebody else's expense. No, that's not true. How we actually create wealth is a very interesting question, but it's certainly happened in my lifetime. I mean, when I was a kid, we lived on £6 a week, less than $20. Think what's happened to the wealth in the world since then. Everybody who grew up in England, who's my age and following that, are richer than their parents were in material terms, but not so rich in other terms. That's beginning to come home to haunt us. Even the green people, in a sense, have this utopian dream, which we need to be able to deconstruct. So in the beginning, God is a perfectly rational starting point, that somewhere, looking around this world, even looking outside my window at the moment, and watching the birds, there are amazing things that the more you study them, the more they blow your mind. That there's a mind behind the universe, not unreasonable. And in fact, of course, several serious atheistic philosophers at the end of their life, in the end, admitted there's a mind behind the universe. The most recent pair being Anthony Flew and Nagel. And they got hammered for it. Whereas serious Christian philosophers all the way through, like Plantinga, the critics wisely leave Alvin Plantinga alone because they know they won't beat him. And of course, our community, who ought to celebrate Alvin Plantinga, by and large, don't even know his name, right? Is that true of you?
That would be true.
Do you know who he is?
I don't.
Heard the name? No.
Doesn't ring a bell.
He's not easy to read, but my goodness, he's smart, very smart. So, in the beginning, God is not unreasonable. In the beginning, no God leaves you really stuck, because, okay, let's go and look at the parts of the world where no God is the norm in any practical sense. Well, that's the pagan world. I spent some years there before I understood the reason they have malnourished children is they have no hope that it can change. Hope is one of the things that comes from a belief in a God, especially when he tells you, you're not going to like this story quite frequently, but my objective is that you should become suitable people to live with me forever. But there's a learning program necessary for that. And it's tough, and he makes no bones about it. God does things on purpose every time, for a purpose, and the purpose is ultimately to bring us into a love story with him. That gives you reasons to cope with all the struggles that come your way. And people are not coping at the moment, are they? I mean, the young in particular have been so hammered by the mismanagement of COVID. They are hopeless, really, seriously. And we have a story that can bring hope back into their lives, but we're not telling it very well. So in the beginning, what is the first question we need to ask, or who? Our friends that we care about, people we work with and interact with. They need to wake up that they're like zombies, and the gospel, the story can come along, that we are creatures. The evidence for that is growing. I mean, one of the great things that's happened in my lifetime is people in the molecular biology area, they don't want to talk about this anymore. They haven't quite got to where the cosmologists and the quantum physicists have got, where they talk about God all the while and say, okay, well, we need shorthand, we do the physics as though there isn't a God, but you can't help thinking about it and writing books about it. And now the same thing inevitably is happening in molecular biology, because it's just so stunning that there's a message in every cell in your body, 3 billion odd letters long, 2 meters if you stretch it out. But God is so good at origami, he can pack it in a cell you can't see so you can't see it till you get modern microscopes. And even then you can't see the details of that message. But it's a message. And you can't begin to think about messages without thinking about message writers. When you tell them next that it's a coded message, it blows the mind. You win that battle every time. And then you come to the chemistry, same thing. The gap between the inorganic world and the organic world is unbridgeable. And the more the details of what goes into the specific formation of molecules, blowing the mind. Anybody who doesn't know about this, just go and listen to James Tour from what's the name of the university in Houston, Rice. He's very, very good on this. Born in a Jewish family, grown up, and wasted his time for a while, and then became a Christian, and things fell into place, and he's incredibly productive. But talking about this, he's winsome, and he can communicate the complexities of what he's doing to any thoughtful person, even not very thoughtful person. So that one is also over. The idea that we're creatures, let's face it, it looks as though we are. If you don't believe anything except molecular biology as being true, it's not an unreasonable conclusion to draw from what you're looking at. Michael Denton's whole series of books over what he's been writing for over 25 years now, starting with Nature's Destiny. No, that wasn't the first. Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. He likes putting it to the opposition, which he wrote over 25 years ago, but he's written 4 or 5 books now. Every time looking at the sheer complexity of biology and biochemistry and saying, how do you handle this? So if the Christian mind is going to come alive, which it has to, that's what we tried to do at Augustine College, and COVID has set us back. Now I think we've probably got to go back to parents. I'd be interested if people listening to this podcast would respond to this in some way, if there's anyone listening. I think my job now is to help parents to set the table so that the intellectual table, so that their children would at least be open to coming to take part in what we do, and then to clone something like it in every city on the continent. In fact, every church could be the basis for a little bit of this. I'm going to do a series in Pennsylvania in March, I think it is, in a church. And I'm going to use that opportunity to talk about how do we train the minds of our children? How do we prepare their minds for the world in which they have to live, so that faith is central to it, not peripheral to it? Use it as the foundation stone. Lewis's very simple statement, and I think the end of the first chapter of The Abolition of Man: if nothing can be assumed, nothing can be proved. Something has to be self-evidently true. And what is increasingly self-evidently true from what we're doing is that we're creatures, that creation happened. And so that's where we would start from. Now, the Jews, when Jesus came, at least they accepted that. But they thought they could do it on their own. We keep the law and God will come. But they've never managed it and never will. What Jesus did when the Sermon on the Mount was to demolish that approach. He said, yeah, the law has been very good for you, and we'll get to talking about that in a little bit, but you're not going to become perfect by knowing the law, because you can't do it. As Paul put it beautifully later in one of my favorite aphorisms in the New Testament, the law is a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. One of the things that we come into this world with is moral knowledge, but we know what's good and true, and we try to do it, but we always fail at one level or another. We make progress in various ways, but it's one step forward and two back quite frequently. You see what's happening in war wherever it happens, happening in Ukraine now. Absolutely awful brutality on both sides. We're a fallen creature. So once you've got to God as the first thing, and then recognize that you're a creature, then the next thing is to help children to look at nature and understand this is beautiful. They have it. It's the easiest thing in the world to do with them. I mean, we live on a farm and I have lots of grandchildren, but the first opportunity of the year for the young ones, the first joy of a new growing season for me is a tiny little grass. It's called blue-eyed grass, and the flower is a few millimeters across. It's worth looking at with a magnifying glass. It is so exquisitely beautiful, and when it grows in clumps, it's a lovely blue, like the scilla blue of early spring as well. But children, you only have to show it to them. You don't have to tell them what response to have. They have it spontaneously. That's beautiful. It's written in our souls. You never see an animal stop and look at blue-eyed grass. They're only looking to see whether they can eat things. What's different about us is the next thing on this list. We can appreciate that goodness because, according to our story, we are made in the image of God. Now, the image of God, what is it? It's not material, as John puts it in his gospel. God is pure spirit, and that those that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So here we come across the fundamental difference between us and all the animals. Yes, you may teach some of the higher apes to have some material words for material things like food that they will get, and they'll make a sound that you train them to say because then they get a banana or whatever. But they're never going to have any abstract world, any imaginary world, any world of metaphor. It's not available to them. They're a bunch of instincts. I mean, every now and again when we don't have cows on the farm anymore at the moment, but at this time of year the calves would be coming along, and every now and again a stupid calf would get in the way when you were putting a big bale out and all the cows came hurrying along. They could get trampled. We'd lose a calf every now and again. Now, you couldn't imagine humans doing that. You don't trample on our young. And the mother is, a little bit upset for a little while, and then it's over, and life goes on. No imaginary world, no world of the spirit. That's where our morality comes from. And it's hardwired. We're made in that way, and at the heart of God is goodness, truth, beauty, all those things. So our children, when they come into the world, they have those concepts, and we only have to, our job is just to bring them to life. And that's what Leon Cass does so well in his discussion of Genesis. He's on his way back to faith. He's not a believer. I don't know whether he is by now, but certainly when he wrote that book, he wasn't. And he's honest about it at the beginning, saying he wants to understand why his parents and grandparents gave up a way of understanding that had kept the Jews alive without a country for thousands of years. And they more than survived. Wherever they went, they made progress. That's astonishing. We couldn't run our own banking system. The Jews had to do it for a long, long while. I'm sorry about that buzz in the background. I hope it doesn't disturb you too much. Oh, it stopped. That's good. So we need to get people to think their way through these things a bit more. Certainly, for any grandparent listening, listen to the first things your grandchildren say and watch for the first thing they say that involves an immaterial thing like love or beauty or truth or something like that. Fairness, justice. My favourite, as I've said on this podcast before, is Not Fair. A philosopher could write a book on that title, but a child who hasn't yet got the capacity to make a grammatical sentence understands that concept. He's getting a cookie, I should get a cookie. On what grounds? Because it's right. Where did that come from? No animal behaves that way. We're the only one. So this would be about number 4 on my list of the rules of life. In the beginning, God, creation, a good creation, the Imago Dei. And then, of course, what Chesterton said is surely the one Christian doctrine that needs no proof. The fall. Look at your own life, look at your children. We all know it. In that lovely phrase, I think at the end of the 3rd chapter of Orthodoxy, he says, we all know that we are the survivors of a colossal wreck that went down at the beginning of time. It's a lovely picture in one sentence. The first fixed and real characteristic that we have is that we couldn't help but screw up in paradise. And if we'd been there, we would have done the same. Because along with those good things, there's hierarchy. And you see how hierarchy really upsets people today. Jordan Peterson constantly gets into trouble from the feminists about hierarchy, to which his response is basically, get used to it, it's the way everything is. And that's true. So Milton put it into the speech of the devil when, after the fall from heaven, he said, better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. And the basic sin of the Garden of Eden is we wanted to be autonomous. We wanted to be God, and Satan played that card beautifully, and we swallowed it, and we've been paying ever since. Now, God obviously knew about that because in the long term, instead of being full of envy, which we are so easily, we will be full of delight at the whole structure of everything. It won't be an issue. We won't be bothered by this self-conscious comparison stuff that we do all the while. I think that will be the real joy of heaven. That's over, gone, finished. No space for that anymore. And that would make an entirely different world. We've no idea what it will be like. We get some sense of it now with all these people who are being resuscitated for a long, long period and have out-of-body experiences. And when they come back, they're astonishing. And they have such a degree of continuity. There's all sorts of little clues popping up. I think God is sort of giving one shake of the last shake of the story to see if people will wake up. I don't know whether they will or not. And of course, it's our job to wake them up. I mean, in his first sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, what Jesus says is, what I'm talking to you about now is how you become an effective disciple who can be properly described as the source of salt and light in the world. Now, America has, the liberals love to make fun of Massachusetts and the Puritans who wanted America to be the city set on a hill. That is the way Jesus illustrates the function of light. A city that is built on a hill cannot be hid. You are to be like that. People are to see your good works and be drawn to your Father in heaven. That's our job. But before that, interestingly, he puts salt before light. And we don't think about salt very well because we immediately have the picture of that white stuff that you can shake out of a container of any sort. But that's not the salt that Jesus was talking about. And that's not pure sodium chloride. If it was, it would be a solid rock in no time at all. It has to have other things put into it to make it run as it does, to keep it dry, so to speak. But salt is not widely deposited around the world, and it's much needed for two reasons. I mean, it's in the sea, but if you're inland, there are a few major deposits of salt around the world. And it was so valuable that you could be paid in salt. And the word in Latin for salt is salere, from which we get salary. You get the point. So when you draw your salary, you're drawing your salt. And it was valuable. You could trade it for other things or whatever, or you could use it yourself. Now, its primary functions were two. One was to preserve what is good, and the other, by the same token, to destroy what is bad, particularly food. So at the end of the summer, at the beginning of fall, the housewife would need to salt down some fish and some meat for the winter. And off to the market she would go to get her salt. And a good businessman would make sure that his sack of salt was very salty at the top, because salt was of different qualities depending on how much dirt it had got in it, the silicates and the aluminum salts and all the rest, and how much sodium chloride it had got. Now, so she'd buy a good sack of salt, she thought. But if that sack had been standing outside his shop and there'd been a sudden torrential downpour in the summer, and the bottom couple of inches of that sack had been underwater for a few minutes, that would mean the bottom of the sack, when it dried out, would look the same. If you want an analogy of why perception is not everything, this is it. For a sack of salt, perception is no use at all if it's rock salt. So the sodium chloride, the bit that does all the work, very water soluble, gone from the bottom. But when it dried out, the sack would look the same as it did before. Might have to fill it up a tiny bit at the top, but not much, because the salt's not a large part of the components in the sack. So the housewife would start putting her fish salt. She'd get tired of tasting. And a few weeks later, one of her salted down containers would start to smell very nasty. Did she blame the salt, or did she blame the fish? She blamed the salt. You see what Jesus is saying to us as Christians in that point. If you are my disciple, you are to be salty. You are to be an affront to what is evil. They will hate you for that, but that's one of the things you have to do. Say, that's not right. We must change it. And time again, that has happened. Your country has got plenty of examples of that. The first country in the world to get rid of slavery was England, and it was driven entirely by the Christian motif. The discussions of slavery at the moment are so bad because they have no history at all. If you don't know how to talk about it, listen to Tom Sowell on slavery. He's got every right to talk about it black, and he does it brilliantly. Every culture that we know anything about practiced slavery in one form or another. It's in the Bible, etc., etc. There's nobody who's innocent in this world. So, when things go badly wrong, when you wake up in the morning and there's been a terrible crime, we say, oh, those people, they must be so bad. But then the next Christian thought should be, what have we failed to do? Where Christianity takes deep root, cultures improve. The norms of culture improve. I've seen that in my lifetime, and I've seen its decay as well, and I've watched it begin to grow in places where the Judeo-Christian story has only penetrated relatively recently. The thing that we as particularly evangelicals get wrong is that we think that conversion changes everything overnight, but it doesn't. What conversion does is change your status in God's sight. You are seen as brought into the kingdom by the sacrifice of Christ. But it doesn't make you a good person the next day, does it? We go on with our old sins regularly. I mean, I still struggle with sins I've had since I was a teenager every now and again. We all do that. We know that we don't have to do it. That's what the Bible teaches. You are not necessarily under the power of sin, but you can't do it. You need me to help you. That's why we don't talk about this enough in church. I make this point frequently by misquoting St. Paul. I find that misquoting the Bible while you're preaching is a very good thing to do, because you can watch the audience and see whether or not they wake up. And usually they don't. So I will say this. Paul says in writing to one church, the preaching of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who have been saved, it is the power of God. And then I look at them and I say, see, you don't understand that. I have just trashed the intellectual history of the Christian world in one sentence, and you don't seem to care. Would you like a second try? So I do it again, and then I do it correctly. And not everybody gets it immediately. The correct one would be, the preaching of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. That tense is critical. Paul, all the way through, is more interested in praying for people when they have become Christian, in a sense, than before they become Christian, because he understands that the Holy Spirit is the only person that brings us into the faith. But then we are left with the problem of working out what it means and how it works. And that is the process of being saved week by week. And if I was a pastor, which I'm not, I mean, the church would be empty in a week or two with me as a pastor. But one of the things I would do is I would ask on Sunday morning, I want to hear prayers from the congregation describing how you have experienced salvation in your life this week. Where has God worked in your life to move you a little bit closer to what he wants you to be? Are you being saved as a present continuous thing? That's what Paul wants. He writes to Ephesians, says, it's really worth praying for you. I hear how you're beginning to love one another. That's really good. Let's get to work on that. And in every case in the epistles, he sees a particular trouble in a church. So the epistles are all written on purpose for particular reasons. And then he says, okay, what are we going to do about this? And his view is that if I teach them some theology with that in mind, that can do the job. So you get about 3/4 or more of the epistle on theology. And then at the end, he teaches a very brief ethics course. You couldn't run an ethics course on what Paul has to say about ethics, because it's a fabrication of the intellectual mind. He says, now, if you've understood what I'm saying to you, this means you've got to settle your marital divisions peaceably. You've got to love your spouse, love your children, and pay your servants daily for the servants. That's a pretty simple outline of life, but that's what it is. That's what it's about. So going back to Genesis, Paul, of course, deeply steeped in this stuff. there's no word from Adam in the first story. I'm sure he's totally overwhelmed by finding himself alive and not understanding himself at all. Then God teaches him a bit about his capacities by bringing the animals to him to name them, and he realizes he has naming characteristics, that he can look at animals and begin to see relationships, which is the beginning of intellectual activity. But it's not until he's made to see Eve as what she's meant to be, and suddenly he says, wow, he's overwhelmed when he's struck by love. But there's no detailed training. Before the fall, they had a relationship with God. He walked with them, is the metaphor, in the garden in the cool of the day, and pointed out that they could eat of everything except 2 trees, and of course that's the metaphor for the fall. And they fell. And when he puts them out into the world, all that they've got is that they are to care for the world. They're going to have to grow their food by the sweat of their brow, and they're going to have to populate the world, and that will be painful every now and again for the woman. The guy has to sweat every day. The woman has to sweat for longer and worse every few months or so. That's all they've got, plus this moral knowledge which is written in their heart. They know what good and evil is, so that when God comes to Cain, he says, evil is crouching at the gate and you must control it. He doesn't say he's going to do anything about it. He's going to teach him through it. But it's his job to do something about it. And of course, he fails, as we all do. And there are consequences. So the next step in the training that has to go along, again, we try and avoid because we don't like consequences. Our world tries to pretend that they're not built in, but they are. Everything we do has consequences, particularly everything in the moral world. Consequence is what the Jews teach to their children. And we need to do it a lot more. They are taught to do it later on, and we'll get to that probably in a week or two's time. But if you're wanting to think what it involves, I give you a foretaste. The essence of Jewish history is very different from every other history in the world. All the rest of us tart up our heroes to make them good people. Robin Hood was a thug, but we made him into an icon of virtue and social justice. Some of your founders were not the nicest of men, but they did a good job in many ways. You were blessed with your founding fathers, because the best of them understood that what was happening was a gift of what had already happened before. John Adams' famous line that our Constitution is for a religious people. It is wholly unsuited to any other. And even Ben Franklin, who didn't live the most upright of lives at the beginning of the meetings in Philadelphia, said we'd better pray at the beginning, because if this doesn't go right, we will certainly swing together. So let's start by praying together. And the basic premises of what constituted a good world were understood by your founders in a way that if the modern guys took over, they wouldn't. I mean, they put together a constitution which is almost unworkable. We have 3 components to it. The Senate, the House of Representatives, and the executive, and the law. So you've got the Senate and the Constitution and the political people. You've got the executive in the White House, and you've got the judges. And that could work because they realized that since we're all sinners, and nobody would argue against that when you were being founded, the biggest problem for us is going to be people who abuse the system for their own ends. We won't be able to stop it, but we must make it as difficult as possible. So you're going to see in the next little while, starting in the new year, that working out, because Biden and company cannot rule without the agreement of the Republicans. So you're seeing your constitution work as it should, forcing them to find common ground, and having to agree that where we don't disagree, those things have to go on the back burner. They'll come back again in another 2 years' time, perhaps. And it worked brilliantly. See, everywhere else, it doesn't. The Western world, it did. And the reason it works so well, of course, is also common law, which you got from Britain. And common law is an incredible human construct. It goes right back to the time of King Alfred, when even travelling around a small place like Britain was difficult, and he unified everything up to the Scottish border. But now there was the problem what to do about justice. And Alfred was one of our most Christian kings. He translated some of the Bible into the vernacular for his people. And he said, well, as in the founding of America, you had to run on a local area for many things. You're a big country, and the only way you could get around it was horseback, or a little later trains. Roads didn't come till much later. So congregational and community was forced on you in that process. And that's what the cowboy films show you something about, if you're willing to think about it. But common law, Alfred said, you have to go, he chose wise men, he said, you have to go out and hear the hard cases. And when you get there, first of all, you say, what would your community intuitively think they would do? And that's where you start. So 12 just men and true was the basic rule. Now, you could have your codified law, but the point about common law is codes are blunt instruments. When you write things down, you don't know all the situations that are going to come up. So common law is an absolutely brilliant way to change that. It wasn't written in stone, and some of your people seem to think the Constitution, no, it's not written in stone, because you have common law too. You've taken it over for good reason. So they would say, yeah, but all these other things come into it. No, we're not going to punish this guy for what happened. Yeah, what he did was wrong, but he was driven to it, etc., etc. And so you build up case law over time, which civilizes a community and gives you a very nuanced approach to justice, because justice is a really big problem. And we're getting into trouble in all these areas because, for instance, no law school that I'm aware of has a real philosophy course on the nature of justice. Medicine doesn't have a course on the nature of medicine. Now, for the lawyers, the problem is, without a lawgiver above the judges, you have a problem of inevitable conflict of interest. If I was running the system, the first thing I would do would be to say lawyers cannot sit in Congress making the law. I wouldn't mind them so much in the Senate, but because they have an obvious conflict of interest. They make their money out of the law, so they write laws that will employ lawyers. You see it all the while. The medicine began long before we had no effective treatment really until the 1860s. It wasn't until then that it was actually a good idea to go to the doctor when you felt you were ill, if you wanted to survive, because going to the doctor was not correlated with a longer life, rather the opposite, because some of the treatments were bad. It's almost certain that George Washington was killed by being bled too much by his doctor. These things happen, but the intent was not evil. So I usually say to doctors, there are 4 things you need to think about. You need to think about judgment after death, because logically you cannot trust a doctor as much if he thinks there's nothing after death than if he thinks he will be judged. That's why it's dangerous. Euthanasia and abortion, whatever else you think about them, you should say not doctors. It's not intrinsically medical, and it's intrinsically a source of conflict of interest for people who want their own way. And you could teach people to do both those things in 6 weeks with ease. You don't need to go to medical school for 6 years to do them. And they are the people who should do it. They can't recruit. You'd have to think that one through a bit more, but at least don't contaminate medicine with it. And once doctors start to kill, it's inevitable that it will spread to where it shouldn't, and it's already happening. The death rates are going up by killing. So all the things they said at the beginning, they're now killing children who they decide are going to have a life not worth living. That would mean Helen Keller, for instance, if she, instead of getting an infection, had come into the world blind and deaf, she would have been killed. But America would be better off without a Helen Keller. God knows what he's doing, even in that area. And I spent my life with those children that the modern liberal wants to kill at birth or stop them being born in the first place. These are not little things. They're being taught step by step. So from the expulsion from the garden, there's no laws beyond the ones that are written on our hearts and experience over time. And of course, we don't do well. We're smart and we're dangerous. So it gets to Babel, and they've decided they're going to outsmart God, a symbol of their non-requirement of God. And God says, that's enough. And that's where, according to the biblical story, he confused their languages. Now, up until then, certainly for nomadic Jews, life was the immediate family and clan. Tribe, they just about made to nation. No, that came later. But once the languages were separated out, then you had a base for nationalism. And the people who intuitively recognized that, as you did early on, language enshrines all sorts of cultural norms. And if they aren't shared, you don't have a nation. You have a collection of people who come together for their own reasons. And that's what we have in the modern world. Given the huge immigration processes that are going on, people migrate primarily for economic and political reasons. They don't migrate into a story that's better thinking of it that way, and we don't even ask them to think about it that way, which we should do. I mean, if you believe there is no meaning beyond this life, you will have a very materialistic culture, and it will be very competitive and nasty, and the politics, unless you're very well set up, which you're currently blessed with in the United States, but it's open season for tyranny, and we're having that preached to us by Putin and Xi in China over the next little while. And it's time for us as Christians to talk about these things, think about these things, so that we can encourage the conversation. There are people having them, but the people who are doing it, like Douglas Murray, for instance, was a Christian, gave it up, and now says he's 99% back, but he's not back. He was a homosexual, but I don't know whether he's still practicing even. But he's honest about what he wants to see happen. The War on the West is a book that every evangelical Christian should read, and The Madness of Crowds, simply to wake you up and say, you've got work to do if you want your children to live in a world that's anything like the one you have. And I think at that point we should stop, because we're going to have a knock on the door as people arrive in about 8 minutes' time.
Thank you, Dr. John, and thank you guys all for listening. If you have a question that you want Dr. John to answer for you, you can write that at www.johnpatrick.ca/ask, or you can find that link in the description below. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you next week.